Before I start, I need to remind you that this is a common non-fest gacha banner, meaning it's usually a lower chance of getting Uber normally and may or may not be guaranteed. It's always recommended to only roll during guaranteed 11 draw if you want to use cat food. That aside, let's talk about this set. Currently, in the making of this video, the latest version of the game is 9.10 and Dragon Emperors is the second ever set to get a full set of true form on a set with 8 units in it. This Uber pool currently holds these units in unit number order: Sodom, Megidora, Vars, Kamukura, Raiden, Dioramos, Ganglion, and Gladios. This pool also has a legend rare, High Lord Babel. As mentioned earlier, currently all units in this pool has a true form, however as of Battlecut's version 9.10, the only ones that has talents are Vars, Megidora, Dioramos, and Sodom. Therefore, evaluations of certain units might still be outdated in the future. Now let's move on into the set overview. Dragon Emperors is a set full of, well, would you believe it, dragons. Other than that, this set still has a general similarities from one another. The theme of this set is that it's centered around units with gigantic health and high cost, as well as high sturdiness. A lot of these units in this set also has the ability to knock back enemies and occasionally slowing them as well. Of course, there are some exceptions which we'll get into when we review the units one by one. As usual, by default I will talk about these units by their true form unless stated otherwise. Several units in this set, however, are still usable even before their true form, but for simplicity's sake, true forms are still the default unless I talk about their evolved form. Now let's begin with the units review. Let's start with Sodom. God Emperor Sodom may also be mistook as Baronsai with horns. Sodom is a ranged semi-tanker unit with over 100k health at level 30. His range is the same as that of Manic King Dragon. He has the guaranteed ability to knock back and resist floating enemies as well as having knockback immunity. His talents also allows him to add Relic into his targeted trait, granting curse immunity, as well as another talent that grants a small chance of weakening enemies. Let's talk about his positive points first. First of all, he has a knockback immunity on Tanker, which is a pretty good resistance ability. Having knockback resistance means that you are much more sturdy and you are not going to get bullied by like stupid trolley bloggers or something, for example. Sodom's knockback is also guaranteed, which makes it pretty reliable. Usually random knockbacks can have a really weird interaction, but guaranteed consistent knockbacks are usually much more controlled and are less dangerous to your units. His base health, like I mentioned earlier, is also pretty good. It's already over 100k HP at level 30 and he still has floating and relic resistance ability to boot. Speaking of relic targeting, that's also a pretty rare niche to have and he has a pretty decent matchup against relics too. However, his negative points are also pretty notable to say for the least. To name a few, his movement speed is painfully slow. We might talk more about this in this video. His cost is also really high at 6,450 and the cooldown is okay, but it could be a bit lower, especially considering that he's supposed to be a tanker. Due to his mediocre standing range and his relatively long force swing, he also may sometimes miss his targets due to certain circumstances, which can be pretty bad because his attack rate is also really long. Aside from that, his weakened talent that I mentioned earlier is very unreliable. It only has a 30% proc chance and it doesn't really weaken for that long. It's not really worth spending all the NP into. Other than that, his usages outside of his traits is also not good. He doesn't really have a good generalist quality. All in all, Sodom is, well, let's just say he's not known for being good. He has his usages and he even works extremely well in stages like an Ancient Curse, but that's about as much as he shines, and that requires fulfilling 2 of his talents. He's not that great in general usage and he does not really have that much of an interesting usage. Sodom suffers from being too mediocre in every way. He can proc, he can tank, and he has the range to be a damager, but he's not especially great at any of that. Once in a while you could use him, maybe for some floating enemies, maybe to knock back Amos, but that's pretty much it. He's not really a big game changer and his niche isn't that great at all. All in all, he's just mediocre at best as an Uber. Next up we got Megidora, the true form being God Emperor Megidora. I also talked about him before in one of my previous videos, comparing him with Dade Masamune from the Vajira set. While the video is slightly outdated, most of my points in that video still stands. Still, I will talk about him here anyways. Megidora is one of the most run-in-the-mill generalists out there. He's got great damage output, good attack rate, and good standing range. He has the 50-50% chance ability to knock back as well as slow floating enemies, and his talent even grants the chance to unleash wave attacks. His other talents includes increased knockback chance as well as cursed immunity. Like mentioned earlier, Megidora has good generalist qualities. This includes having good health, having workable standing range, pretty good attack rate, great damage output, and like I mentioned earlier, he has a wave talent, which is a great addition to basically any generalist really. In the end, he's usable as a ranged attacker that deals great amount of damage and has all-rounder great stats. He's also usable before getting true form, so he's a great unit for early game, especially when Bunbuns runs rampant. With his anti-floating ability as well as good stats, he's able to destroy early game Bunbuns very well. However, there are some complaints about him too. For example, the ability of knockback and slow can be pretty bad as it can knock the enemies back into their backliners, which can cause trouble for your cat units. Other than that, his price is also fairly expensive for a generalist like him, especially with his range. Speaking of range is also not that great. Like as mentioned earlier, he has workable standing range, but it's not really a safe standing range. His wave attack, while also sounds great, is only 15% chance, making it very unreliable. To make matters worse, sometimes this wave attack can cause even more trouble with his knockback and slow ability, which can cause even more enemies getting knocked back and slow and might even guarantee the death of your cats. Another thing that makes Megidora somewhat undesirable is how generic he is. He's a very basic generalist with a niche that is not quite favorable past early SOL. He can get replaced by a lot of other generalists if you have them. Not to mention, floating niche, especially against Bunbun variants, get completely destroyed by Sanzo and Kamukura, as well as many other common anti-floatings. Overall, Megidora himself is not exactly a bad unit. It's actually a pretty good generalist with very rounded stats. It's just that despite sometimes outperforming certain other generalists, it doesn't really have a strong niche that sets him apart from them. His niche isn't that great, his generalist quality is good, but that's about it. Moving on, next up is Vars, God Emperor Vars in true form. Funnily enough, according to the description, Vars is the Dragon Rider cat, not the dragon. Vars, compared to Megidora, has similar ability with different typings, similar health, similar cooldown, similar price, and also the same 3 knockback counts, as well as usability before true form. Despite having slightly lower damage output compared to Megidora, Vars is blessed with a significantly higher range and has slower speed. His ability is a 50-50% chance to knock back and slow black enemies, but talents allow him to also target relics as well as gaining curse immunity. His other talents includes increased knockback chance up to 30%. Since he's rather similar to Megidora, I'll just get straight to the point. He's a really good generalist with great damage output, attack rate, and great health, but has very high cost and mediocre knockback count. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? You might start seeing this pattern here with the Dragon Emperors. Compared to Megidora though, Vars' high 460 range is quite above average and gives him the edge against Sloth and Master Ray. His ability against black enemies doesn't come as an importance much often, since black enemies generally gets controlled pretty easily by Bomber and Pizza, though it does allow him to control Lenores very easily, as Lenores sometimes may still be a threat even in late game stages. His target relic talent gives him an even wider usage, allowing him to control enemies such as Amost or even Autumn, as well as many other relic enemies. That being said, he also has the same problem of having the knockback and slow ability combination, which can be disadvantageous. He also doesn't do too well against Toucan and Takis despite having anti-black ability, and aside from his occasional usages against certain relic enemies, which only appears in very late game, and Lenore, his niche isn't really all that interesting. At most, you can probably use him against Okame if you revolve your lineup around him. Overall, Vars is still a great all-rounder generalist, but at least his niche is more favorable than Megidora due to his anti-relic talent. People might favor him over Megidora even as a generalist though, because 460 range is really good range. Next up, we got Kamukura, God Emperor Kamukura in true form, definitely not Shenron. Kamukura is also similar to Vars. This is closer to Vars than it is to Megidora, as it has an even higher range than Vars, standing at 475. But like last time, it has great health, good damage, similar cooldown, and even higher price and mediocre 3 knockback count, as well as being usable pre-true form. Yeah. Believe it or not, it still has the slow and knockback ability, but Kamukura targets red enemies instead. Currently, Kamukura has no talents though. As for his ability, target red is arguably somewhat better than Megi's floating or even Vars' black target trait. Kamukura is able to control certain enemies like Berserkori or Cappies pretty well, and sometimes JK Bunbun too, which can be great in stages such as Ogre Island or Unjust War. It sorta loses usage past those though, with more and more backliners being a threat. There's really not that much to talk about. His generalist quality is very similar to Vars, so I'll just get straight to the point. And overall, boy am I repeating myself a lot, but he's a great all-rounder generalist with a decent niche. Kamukura still has a possible talent in the future though, so who knows what potential he can get, but currently I'd say he's about as nearly as favorable as Vars, maybe slightly below due to less usages in UL, but having red targeting is not something that is completely useless. It still has its usages and it still comes off as a pretty good unit and a good generalist. Next up is Raiden, with God Emperor Raiden as true form. Apparently it's supposed to be a machine to kill dragons, but he's in a set filled with dragons, so Raiden is a breath of fresh air considering he finally is actually one of the more somewhat unique Dragon Emperor. Although he still retains some of the DE specials such as having good health, decent damage output, and 3 knockback range, and relatively high cost, he got somewhat more of a uniqueness that sets him apart from the other DE. For one, his ability is not a 50-50% chance of knockback and slow, rather it's a 100% chance of knockback and strong against. His straight targeting is red. His cooldown is the shortest out of all DE, being at 123 seconds, and he has the cheapest deploy cost out of all DE at 4,920, which is still kinda a lot. His standing range is merely 415, which is relatively low but workable on what he can do. His damage output is also kinda just okay, so he's actually somewhat below average for a generalist, but he's still usable at most. He also unfortunately currently does not have any talents available. Despite being kinda below average for a generalist, when he's against red enemies, he can actually perform extremely well. Guaranteed knockback is actually pretty good, especially with his great attack rate, as long as you don't pair it with too much slow or freeze alongside it. It can control many red enemies very well, especially things like Berserkori, JK Bunbun, and Cappy, similar to ones I mentioned with Kamukura. It can also be used against Toucan and Okame, and not to mention that Raiden has strong ability which lets him tank more hits from red enemies and deals higher damage against them. Overall, as a generalist, Raiden performs okay, he's workable, but he shines so much more against red enemies, which sometimes may still appear as a threat here and there. He's actually really great at his niche, and he still has lock potential for possible future talents. A lot of the times he shines more a little bit on mid to late game, but he does kinda lose usages later on. But you know, again, he still has possible talents in the future, so who knows. Moving on, next up is Dioramos, God Emperor Dioramos, the meme man himself. We're returning back to yet another unit with slow speed, knockback, and slow ability with high health and similar cooldown. Yep, it's the DE special. Dioramos targets Angel, and his slow plus knockback ability is guaranteed, not a 50-50% chance like some of his other brothers. His general stats is most similar to Sodom, even standing at a similar range and both having very long attack rate as well as damage output, and both only having 2 knockback count. His cost is a hefty 6,600, making him the priciest Uber to deploy, as well as the 3rd priciest unit in the game. For some reason, despite not targeting alien, he also has a guaranteed barrier break, as well as low immunity ability. Not that his low immunity actually matters, considering he already has a slow speed. He is practically unaffected by slow in the first place anyways. Despite not having any tanker ability, he also has the 5th highest base health in the game, having a whopping 231k health at level 30, just slightly under King Gamirion. His talents allow him to get a 50% damage strengthened at 50% health, as well as resistance against weaken and freeze. I'll get straight to the point. This unit kinda sucks. His ability is very questionable, as knockback and slow is generally a very dangerous ability to have, especially as a guaranteed chance. His speed is immensely bad, his health barely matters with any ability to back it up, he's way too expensive and slow attacking to be a good barrier breaker choice, his damage is not worth the price, and his range is not that good. He does have the 50% strengthened talent, which actually can boost his damage to a pretty competent amount, but it still doesn't really save him from all his other problems, including the bad range and terrible attack rate. The best thing you got going for him is that he's pretty decent at controlling Winged Piggy and possibly Saint Dober. That's kinda all of his usage. Generally, angelic enemies that he can hit, such as generic Angel Peons, Slipnir, Chick-fil-A, and Borofim, has a strong backliner with them, so his ability becomes pretty troublesome. Sure, he alone can tank the backliner, but not your Michels and other supports. Without any resistance ability, Dioramos still gets shredded in a matter of seconds without a good defense, especially against enemies like Angelic Gory, which has a billion DPS. Overall, well, let's just say he has a meme status for a reason. So far, this set has been pretty unfavorable, hasn't it? Especially after Dioramos, right? Well, if you're wondering why anyone even ever rolled this set in the first place, the chances are it's because of this next unit, Ganglion. God Emperor Ganglion. He is pretty much the one savior in this set and is widely considered to be the most wanted Uber in this set. Why, you might ask? What makes him so special? Well, for one, he has nearly none of the negative problem that most Dragon Emperors have. His ability does not have knockback or slow, which is a great start already. Ganglion, unlike every other Dragon Emperors, is not a slow generic range attackers with mediocre ability. Instead, Ganglion is an immensely speedy unit with a big LD as well as great overall stats. He has the ability of strong against alien and zombies as well as Z-Killer. Ganglion has a mere 300 standing range, but his LD reaches up to 550. His true form also increases his survivability by a lot, where he has over 100k health in level 30 as well as 6 knockback counts so that he can reposition himself often. His attack animation are also all backswing, which means every knockback will reset his attack. Ganglion's main usage is a rusher LD, being able to zoom in and deal damage to enemies that are generally standing far back. Of course, his specialty are aliens and zombies. He can destroy a lot of alien and zombie backliner enemies or oncoming peons, given that he has a stepping stone to work with. This includes common enemies such as La Solar, Zamel, Calamari, Project A, Ribbo, Ursa Major, and Cadaver Bear, as well as ranging from immense help to single-handedly destroying certain Advent enemies such as Queen Bee, Zionel, and Puffstay's Comet. Ganglion as a generalist LD unit does not perform that amazing though. His DPS is not that high and his range is really short, and he still has the DE special of having relatively high cost, especially for a short-range suicidal unit like him. Granted, he's still LD, which kinda excuses the DPS, but his performance against his non-targeted traits are just not as amazing as I would say. That being said, his ability is still very much relevant throughout the entire game and is completely deserving the spot of what is widely considered to be the current best Dragon Emperor. Overall, Ganglion is a very powerful unit that comes in handy for many interesting situations. Ganglion fills in a really good niche as well as having very good ability and trait targeting. Undoubtedly a really good unit for what it is worth. Despite its shortcomings, it comes off as a still very valuable asset unlike other generic generalists. Now, let's move on to the final Uber in the set before we move on to the legend. The most recent addition to DE, Gladios, God Emperor Gladios in true form. So now that we've covered the unique entry from DE earlier, it's time to go back to your roots, as Gladios is once again another generic DE. Say it with me: high health, slow speed, high cost, 3 knockback, long attack rate with knockback and slow ability. Yeah. The one thing that makes Gladios somewhat interesting though is that his trait target is traitless. His ability are also guaranteed, which makes him fairly reliable. His standing range is pretty decent at 440, but his damage output is pretty low, which makes him not exactly a good generalist outside of being a traitless targeting. Aside from the generic DE problem that I've repeated like 5 times now, Gladios as an anti-traitless unit is actually pretty respectable. He can help dealing against many traitless enemies such as Aros, Dober, or Cory, or even event bosses such as Crazed or Manic Cat, Tank, Axe, Cow, and Fish, Kappa Jr., or even Uriel and Eulala. Range anti-traitless CC is a rare thing after all, so despite his shortcomings, he can still be a somewhat valuable addition to your units as he fills a really rare niche. Just to repeat, the generic DE problem still exists, mainly him being super slow, prone to missing, which can cause a brick problem, and having long attack rate as well as somewhat dangerous ability that can push your cats into enemy backliners if one exists. His evolved form is somewhat usable too. Before his true form, his knockback and slow ability is 50-50% chance, where his true form makes it guaranteed. If you wanna play with RNG, it can still work. 50-50 is not too low for randomness after all. Overall, Gladios is is not actually that bad of a unit. He's actually one of the better Dragon Emperors. His generalist quality is not there, but he has a great traitless targeting as well as somewhat reliable ability that helps on a niche that is rarely filled. He has his problems unfortunately, but it doesn't fully stop him from fulfilling his role decently well. Now, with all Ubers covered, it's time to talk about the legend rare of this set, the almighty High Lord Babel, or in Evolve, Babel the Darkflame. Babel is a tanker with the second highest health in the game. That's right, unlike other DE, Babel's purpose is actually to tank, so his high health is not for nothing. Being a legend rare, he has the access to insane resistance ability, which resists enemies' attacks by 6 to 7 times instead of the usual 4 to 5 times. He targets red and floating enemies, and aside from that, he also has full immunity against slow and freeze, which is actually quite a big deal for a tanker like him. Babel's speed is not as bad as his other brethren, having 8 speed, which is still relatively slow, but not to the point where it's troublesome at all, and for some reason he also has 390 range. Being a DE, his cost is also still hefty as hell, having 6,750 cost, being the second most priciest unit in the game, only beaten by Killer Cat at 7,500. His cooldown is also somewhat long at 158 seconds, though it's not to the point where it's too terribly long. Babel's base health at level 30 is 255k, which means that with full treasure effect, his effective health against floating and red reaches up to 1,785,000. Yeah, it's quite insane. He can tank a lot of red and floating enemies all day, including but not limited to Crazed or Manic Bird, Pigeons, Brawlos, Little Bonbons, Berserkori, Toucan, Professor A, and advents like Queen Bee, Hanya, and Okame. Unfortunately though, due to not having Toxic and Curse immunity, he can't exactly tank Gobbles and doesn't perform too well against certain relic/floating hybrids like Autumn or Loki, and may lose his resistance if some unit curses him. This also can apply to Queen Mother V stage. Babel's slow and freeze immunity also comes in handy against enemies that have these abilities, most especially Professor A and Queen Bee. Other relevant enemies includes I Am Face, Crockley, and Henry. There is no doubt about his performance in the field against red and floating enemies, especially the ones that I mentioned earlier, aside from maybe getting barraged by insanely high-powered Cappies or Bonbon. But unfortunately his performance against other traits is underwhelming to say for the least. Despite his gigantic base health, his range isn't high enough to keep him alive for too long, and his immensely long 12 seconds attack rate does not really allow him to defend himself well, and doesn't make him quite worth to use as a generalist attacker. His cost is also immensely huge, making it usually not really worth spawning unless he's fighting enemies that he's effective against. Overall, as a unit, Babel is still a force to be reckoned with. Against the Tracy counter, he's practically an expensive but immovable wall that stays alive for a long time with little to no support, but is unfortunately not great outside of his niche. Compared to other legend rare, Babel is generally considered to be the weakest out of them all, but this does not make him a bad unit necessarily. Babel is still one hell of a force to be reckoned with when used in the right places. That is all of the Dragon Emperor units. A set filled with many chunky generalists with a couple of odd jobs that ended up being the main spotlight. The only reason why you would want to roll this set is most likely either going for Ganglion, maybe Raiden or Gladios, or Babel if you want a tanker or something. That being said, I really can't recommend this set much. The only unit that is super worth getting is Ganglion, while most others are ranging from terrible to mediocre at best. Even if you are rolling guaranteed, that's basically a 1 in an 8 chance that you get Ganglion. It's really not a worth set to roll on in my opinion. If, let's say, you don't mind getting a mediocre generalist and you just badly need any kind of generalist at all, and the top tier guaranteed set has just passed like a few days ago and you can't wait for the next guarantee, I would highly recommend to instead just roll on Galaxy Gals. The Galaxy Gals set is also filled with generalists, ranging from an alright to mediocre to super great. The risk and reward is so much better, seriously. Galaxy Gals is basically just a better Dragon Emperors, and I'll review the set next too. So if you're from the future where I already made a Galaxy Gals set review, be sure to check the review too. In the end, it's still up to you, like always. If you think the 1 in an 8 odds are exciting, go ahead. I would still highly recommend against rolling this set unless they got amazing talents or new entries in the future. So that's my evaluation of the set. Hopefully this sheds some light towards those who are considering to roll this set. Like I said, I can't exactly recommend to roll here unless you're insanely desperate for Ganglion, which honestly you can still find some other replacements usually. That is all for now. Thank you for watching. See you later. Subscribe, check other videos or whatever. And just remember, anime girls are better than chunky dragons. Goodbye.